As aircraft go, the F-86 Sabre is about as iconic as it gets. The aircraft that dominated the air war over Korea became an enduring symbol of the jet age and the Cold War, and so you could hardly blame a young Air Force mechanic for getting a bit carried away. First flown in October of 1947, the North American F-86 Sabre was America's first swept-wing jet fighter. North American Aviation, which had built the also iconic P-51 Mustang during the Second World War, submitted a proposal in 1945 in response to a 1944 Army Air Force requirement for a medium-range, single-seat, high-altitude jet fighter. North American had produced the U.S. Navy's first jet fighter, the FJ-1 Fury, and the XP-86 design was an improved and lighter design. But North American wasn't the only company looking for the contract. Lockheed was developing the F-80 Shooting Star, and Republic Aviation was developing the F-84 Thunderjet. To win the contract, North American needed an advantage, which they got from the Germans. Hitler's scientists had done extensive research on aerodynamics, and much of that research and some of the scientists had been taken home by the Americans as part of Operation Paperclip. Engineers at North American paid particular attention to data collected by the German scientists regarding a swept-wing configuration, which allowed greater speed. North American incorporated a 35-degree swept wing. The first test plane was flown by George Welch, a famous test pilot who had been one of the few pilots to get airborne and score kills against the Japanese at Pearl Harbor. The F-86 had speed records, and in May of 1953, pilot Jackie Cochran became the first woman pilot to break the sound barrier in a Canadian-made version of the Sabre. In combat, the Sabre excelled. While kill numbers have been disputed, during the Korean War, F-86 pilots had at least a 5-to-1 kill ratio against Soviet MiGs, and 40 U.S. pilots became fighter aces flying the F-86. Versions of the F-86 were produced in the United States, Canada, and Australia, and eventually were used by 30 different nations. In all, 9,860 aircraft of all variants were built, making the F-86 the most produced jet fighter in the West. George R. Johnson would have been very familiar with the F-86 when he enlisted in the United States Air Force in 1954. Described as a dark, husky, curly-haired boy, he had grown up in Pima, Arizona, had been an aviation enthusiast his entire life. Aviation writer and Air Force veteran Paul Mather wrote in the November 2011 edition of Smithsonian Magazine, Johnson still remembered the bright yellow AT-6 Texan trainer that buzzed his family's Pima home early in World War II. Author Joseph Stalker wrote in the February 1959 edition of Argosy magazine that George R. Johnson was that kind of kid, as airstruck as they come. He read about them, he talked about them, and thanks to an Air Force that is always hospitable to eager kids, he lived and worked among them. Johnson had his mother's permission to enlist before the age of 18, entering the Air Force at 17 years old. He received basic training at Lackland Air Force Base in Texas, and owing to a mechanical aptitude, was sent to jet engine school at Chanute Air Force Base in Illinois. And while he could work on the Air Force planes that he grew up loving, he could not, however, pilot them. Mather writes, as a boy he had stared at the sun during an eclipse and had slightly burned one retina, making it impossible for him to pass the physical for military pilots, although Stalker noted he was a good mechanic. In October 1955, Johnson was sent to Williams Air Force Base near Phoenix, a flight training school. Basic jet fighter flight training was done in the Lockheed T-33 Shooting Star, but by 1955, Williams was also doing advanced training using the F-86F. The F model had an upgraded engine and a maximum speed of 685 miles per hour. The F-86 was no longer the fastest plane in the Air Force arsenal. The F-100 Super Sabre had been introduced in 1954, but Mather notes the F-86 was still a trusted fighter. Its fearsome reputation in the Korean War, he writes, made flying the Sabre jet a young airman's dream. On September 20th, 1956, Johnson and a crew were working on an F-86F, tail number 52-5039. It was complex work. A cable had been installed incorrectly, and repairs required removing the entire aft end of the airplane. The evening crew on the flight line worked on the aircraft into the night. Such complex repairs required ground tests before the work can be signed off. Johnson put on a headset and asked for permission from the tower to use the taxiway to do an engine check. Stalker wrote, in the quiet of the night, the screaming cadenza of the jet, revving up at full power, sounded like some huge and superhuman creature writhing under the massive torture. Johnson then asked permission to use a runway for a high-speed taxi test, something that was often done, Mather writes, after any work on the brakes or nose wheel. Again, this was routine, and the tower cleared him to use runway 30L. What happened next is a bit unclear. Stalker writes that certainly as subsequent investigations seem to bear out, he had no clear cut plan for doing what he did. 56 years later, Johnson told Mather, "My intentions were still just to do a high speed taxi. I never had a conscious intention to fly that airplane." Stocker explains that the two night duty airmen in the tower watched with only passing interest. The brake check was common, expected that the plane would edge up cautiously to about 35 miles per hour, brake, and then return to the flight line. But he writes, this time, something was fishy. Johnson told Mather, "The nose lifts off the runway at about 105 knots. As I approached 105, I could feel the nose getting light, and I thought I would just wait a few more seconds to see if I could feel the plane getting light on the main gear." Apparently being airstruck caught up with the 20-year-old airman. Stocker writes, and then an incredible thing happened. The jet lifted up gently from the runway and was airborne. Johnson said a few seconds passed, and I just didn't think I had enough room to stop. I wasn't thinking about being in trouble. I was thinking about maintaining climb, airspeed, and when I was in a definite climb, I retracted the landing gear. I was off and committed. He added there was no wind at all that night. The air was smooth as glass. Obviously, this was a dangerous situation. The F-86 was not an easy plane to pilot. Mather writes that becoming an F-86 pilot required at least a year of training and hundreds of hours of flight time. Hours had to be spent in a cockpit simulator before a pilot could solo, and even then the first flight was done with an instructor flying alongside. Johnson had, total, 2 hours of flying with an instructor in a Piper Cub. But he was familiar with the airplane, as a mechanic needs to be, including careful study and intimate knowledge of the flight training manual. Johnson said in 2011, "I knew the numbers on various approach speeds because I knew the pilot handbook. I knew that intimately. Spent a lot of time studying that. I was as prepared as you could be without actually flying." Still, landing wasn't going to be easy. According to Stocker, Johnson contacted the tower and in a strangely calm voice said, "This is Airman First Class George Johnson. I just took off from our field. I thought I wanted to fly this thing, but I've changed my mind. I want to get down." Stocker notes that not only was Johnson's life in danger, but possibly many others, as the city of Phoenix was nearby, as well as all the people at the base. And so, just incidentally, he noted, was a $250,000 plane. The airmen in the tower had already contacted base command, including the officer of the day, Captain Robert McCormick, himself an F-86 pilot. McCormick was able to help Johnson move into a holding pattern around the base at a speed and altitude that would be most fuel efficient. Johnson knew the cockpit, could tell fuel levels, and from there McCormick calculated that Johnson had a little more than an hour of flight time. Calmly, McCormick reassured Johnson that with directions he could land the plane. Johnson said, "Everything got pretty well stabilized with me at slow cruise and orbiting the base. I could see everything moving on the taxiways and runways. I don't recall being frightened, although I was being very careful with the controls." Johnson asked specifically for Second Lieutenant George Madison, an F-86 pilot who had been Johnson's supervisor, to come fly with him in formation to help him land. Madison and pilot Captain Lyndon Kelly hurried into their flight suits and went to the flight line. Madison told Mather, "I knew that if we could get him in a controlled descent of about 500 feet per minute at around 140 knots and keep him lined up with the runway, there was a chance he might survive." As Madison and Kelly moved to the flight line, the base commander, Colonel Jerry Page, gave a sober order. "We want you to get that man down, but not at the expense of your safety and that of the area. Take your time. If you can't get him down, it's just too bad. Don't risk your own lives." Kelly was more experienced and took over the instruction, and quickly determined the best way to get Johnson down. He planned to take Johnson out over the desert to the southwest of the base, letting him approach the runway in a long, straight descent with minimal maneuvering. The runway also had an arresting barrier, which Stocker described as a contrivance of nylon rope, steel cable, and anchor chains used for stopping jets that aborted their takeoffs or overshot their landings. Kelly was able to get Johnson into position and to drop his speed brakes and lower his landing gear. He and Madison flew on either side as he descended. Johnson said, "Madison had me back off the throttle at just the right time, and I touched down very smoothly, right on the runway centerline. I saw both of them accelerate and begin climbing away. One of them said, 'Good boy,' as I touched down. But he was going too fast, and he had eaten up too much runway before he touched down. Madison had to stop himself from yelling to hit the brakes, knowing that overbraking could cause the plane to turn over." Stocker writes that Johnson was going about 170 miles per hour when the F-86 typically landed at 125 miles per hour. It was a tense moment, and Kelly and Madison couldn't stay around to see it. Stocker writes the two pilots, dangerously close to stalling, could wait no longer. They poured on the coal and sped the length of the field and arched into the sky. Johnson hit the barrier at nearly 90 miles per hour. Stalker wrote, "The noise could be heard all the way across the field. The crunching thump as steel cable ripped into the undercarriage. The clank of the heavy anchor chains as they dragged the jet to a convulsive, jarring halt." The first to reach the plane was the base fire chief, Edward Anderson. He found Johnson was calmly flipping off the switches. His flight had taken a total of 1 hour and 2 minutes, and his use of the barrier had done $195.64 in damage to the aircraft. But Page, the base commander, had a probing question the next day. What happens next? Johnson had been given a blood test and found not to have been intoxicated, but he still had stolen government property and endangered lives. While Page was impressed by how coolly he had handled the situation, he knew that Johnson had to face a court-martial, or I would have half my mechanics trying the same damn fool stunt tomorrow. At the court-martial, held in March of 1957, Johnson was allowed to plead to a charge of wrongful appropriation. He was acquitted of a charge of flying the aircraft without proper flight orders or clearance, as that only applied to Air Force pilots. He was sentenced to 6 months confinement, which he served in Williams, and was fined $65 a month for 6 months. He had a reduction in rank, but he was not discharged. Mather writes that Johnson looks back on his imprisonment as not all that depressing. Daily, he was allowed outside to serve on various work details, such as mowing grass. His cell door was seldom locked, and he spent many evenings playing cards with the guards. For good behavior, he was freed after 5 months. Johnson remained in the Air Force until 1961, and then he worked in the computer industry and eventually earned a pilot's license. Mather described him in 2011 as an intensely private man who was amazed that anyone still cared about that flight that he took so long ago. He told Mather, "It was kind of a dumb thing to do, but I got away with it. Had a guardian angel on my shoulder that night." The event's little known, even Mather said, among former F-86 pilots, but it did speak to the stability of the iconic aircraft. When Anderson, the fire chief, got to him, Johnson said to him, "This thing really does fly itself." And it teaches a general lesson as well, that youthful mistakes can be overcome. When asked at the time why he did it, Johnson simply said, "The runway looked so good, I just let her go." I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.